Princess Ilara stood at the edge of the dense forest, her heart pounding in her chest. The cool night air swept through her long hair as she gazed into the darkness, her mind racing with questions. For years, she had been taught to fear humans, to believe they were nothing but savage, dangerous creatures. But tonight, something was different. Something was calling her into the forest. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light on the path ahead. She had snuck away from the palace, away from her father's watchful eyes. Curiosity pulled her deeper into the shadows, away from the safety of the castle walls. She had heard whispers of a strange crash landing somewhere nearby, an event that no one in her kingdom had spoken about openly. As Ilara moved further into the forest, the silence was broken only by the sound of leaves rustling beneath her boots. The deeper she went, the more unsettled she became. The stories about humans flashed in her mind, violent, unpredictable, and brutal. But for some reason, she didn't feel afraid. She felt drawn to whatever waited ahead. Then, out of the darkness, she heard it, something moving. A figure stumbled toward her, limping, dragging its feet. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Could it be a human? The figure came closer, and Ilara's eyes widened in shock. It was a man, dressed in strange, torn clothing, his face covered in dirt and blood. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, filled with exhaustion and pain. He collapsed to the ground in front of her, his body trembling. "Help me." The words barely escaped his lips, his voice hoarse. Ilara stood frozen, unsure of what to do. This wasn't the monster she had been taught to fear. This was a man, vulnerable, hurt, and in need of help. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to call for the guards, but something deep within her stopped her from turning away. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to him. Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice almost shaking. The human looked up at her with weak eyes, his body barely able to support itself. I'm just someone trying to survive." Ilara's mind raced. She had never seen a human so close before. The stories she had been told painted them as savage beasts. But this one, he seemed different. Her eyes scanned his body, noting the cuts and bruises. He had clearly been through a lot. "Why are you here?" she asked, her curiosity overcoming the fear she had been taught. The human winced, but tried to sit up, his gaze locking with hers. I crashed. I don't know how I ended up here. But I can't go back. Not like this." Ilara's heart softened at his words. She couldn't leave him here, alone, suffering in the middle of the forest. But helping him meant defying everything she had been taught, everything her father believed. Could she really do this? She hesitated for a moment, but then, without thinking, she reached down and helped him to his feet. His weight was heavy against her, but she didn't mind. She had to help him. "I'll take you somewhere safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The human nodded, too weak to speak. But in his eyes, Ilara saw something she had never expected: gratitude. And in that moment, she made a decision. She would defy everything she knew. She would help him. The human was no longer a creature to fear. He was a person who needed her, and for the first time in her life, Ilara felt the pull of something more than duty, something that felt like true humanity. Little did she know, this encounter would change everything. Ilara's hands trembled as she helped the human, whose name she now knew was John, move deeper into the forest. The night seemed to grow colder, but the warmth between them was undeniable. She could feel the weight of the moment, a decision she had never imagined she'd make. Her heart raced with questions. What if someone found out? What if her father's soldiers came looking for him? Would she be able to protect him? John's breathing was shallow, and his steps faltered with every move. Ilara couldn't help but notice how fragile he seemed, despite his height and strength. The stories she'd heard about humans were filled with warnings. Humans were dangerous, unpredictable, and violent. Yet here he was, leaning on her for support. and not once had he shown aggression. Instead, he appeared exhausted, vulnerable, and grateful. "Where are you taking me?" John asked weakly, his voice hoarse from the pain and exhaustion. Ilara glanced at him, her gaze softening. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can rest." She had already made up her mind. She couldn't leave him in the forest to die. No matter what her father or the kingdom thought of humans, John didn't deserve to be abandoned like this. They continued walking in silence for a while, the sound of the night around them blending with the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Ilara's mind swirled with questions. Who was John really? How did he end up in her kingdom? And why had he been so different from everything she had been taught? She stopped briefly to look around. There was a hidden cave up ahead, a place she had once used as a child to escape her royal duties. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for now. "Almost there," she said, glancing at John. He nodded weakly, his lips curled into a faint smile. "Thank you for helping me." Ilara didn't know how to respond. She had never expected to be in this situation. Her entire life had been planned for her, every decision made by her father, the king. Humans were nothing more than enemies in her world, and yet here she was, aiding one. The irony wasn't lost on her. As they reached the cave, Ilara gently helped John sit against the stone wall. He winced as he adjusted his position, but he managed to steady himself. Ilara looked around, quickly gathering some leaves and branches to make a simple bedding for him. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. John watched her quietly, his eyes filled with something she hadn't expected, admiration. "You're different from what I thought," he said softly. Ilara frowned. "Different? What do you mean?" "I've heard stories too," John replied, his voice weak but steady. "Of your people, your kingdom. I never thought anyone like you would. Help me." Her heart skipped a beat. What kind of stories? John took a deep breath. "That your people are cold-hearted, ruthless. I've seen it myself. Your soldiers chasing us, hunting us down. You're all taught to fear humans." Ilara's eyes lowered to the ground. She had always believed what her father had told her about humans. They were enemies. They were a threat to her people. But now, looking at John, she couldn't help but wonder if those beliefs were wrong. Could it be that everything she had been taught was nothing more than a lie? "I've never seen a human up close before," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Everything I've been told, it doesn't match you." John smiled weakly. "I guess I'm not like the others." Ilara was silent for a long moment, processing his words. A part of her wanted to argue, to defend everything she had been taught. But the other part, the part that had been feeling a strange connection to this man, felt differently. Her thoughts were interrupted when she noticed his injuries. She quickly moved to gather some water from a nearby stream. Her hands moved efficiently as she cleaned the wounds on his arms and face, and despite her nervousness, she couldn't help but notice how calm he seemed under her care. "You're very brave," she said, as she finished tending to his injuries. "Most people would have been afraid by now. Afraid of the unknown." John looked up at her with tired eyes. "I've learned that fear doesn't help. Sometimes, you have to face things head-on, even when you don't understand them." Ilara paused. His words echoed in her mind. She had always been taught to fear the unknown. But what if John was right? What if understanding and compassion were the answers to everything? As the night stretched on, Ilara stayed by his side, watching over him. She felt a strange bond growing between them, one she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the circumstances, or maybe it was the fact that he was the first person who had made her question everything she had believed. John's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing steadying as he fell into a deep sleep. Ilara remained awake, lost in thought. The world around her seemed so much larger now, filled with questions she had never dared to ask before. And as she watched over him, she knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. The morning sun peeked through the trees, casting soft rays of light onto the forest floor. The world around Ilara felt quieter than it had ever been. The soft hum of birds, the rustling of leaves. Everything seemed to pause as she sat beside the sleeping human. His chest rose and fell steadily as he rested, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe deeply without the weight of her royal duties or her father's expectations pressing down on her. She had spent most of the night sitting by his side, her thoughts swirling. What was she doing? Why had she helped him? Was it out of compassion, or had something deeper, something more dangerous, started to stir inside her? As she watched him, Ilara couldn't deny the connection she felt. The stories she had been told about humans had always painted them as bloodthirsty monsters. But the human lying before her was not a beast. He was vulnerable, hurt, and in need of help. He wasn't the enemy she had been taught to fear. He was just a person. But a nagging thought at the back of her mind tugged at her. What would her father say? The king would never accept such an act. He would see this as betrayal, a grave mistake that could cost her everything. The throne, her title, her family's legacy. Humans had been the kingdom's enemies for as long as she could remember, and her father had always maintained that they were a threat to their way of life. What would happen when the truth came out? Ilara pushed those thoughts aside for a moment as she heard John stir. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the bright morning light. "Hey," he said softly, his voice rough but warm. "Did I sleep through the whole night?" Ilara smiled faintly. "You've been out for hours." John sat up with a wince, testing his injured arm. "I didn't think I'd make it through the night. You're something else, you know." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure you've met plenty of others who've helped you." His expression softened, and he shook his head. "No, not like you. Not many people would take in a stranger like this." Ilara's heart fluttered slightly. She didn't know how to respond, so she stayed silent. The words felt strange on her tongue. She had never felt anything like this before. Every part of her life had been about following orders, maintaining the honor of her bloodline, and protecting the kingdom's interests. But right now, none of that seemed to matter. John noticed the change in her demeanor. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ilara turned away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I'm just wondering what happens next," she said quietly, her gaze falling to the ground. "The king will never understand. He'll never forgive me if he finds out about you." John frowned. "Then don't let him find out." She shook her head. "It's not that simple. My father is the king. What I do, what I say, it all matters. If I go against him, there are consequences." She felt a strange tightness in her chest as she spoke. The weight of her royal blood, her lineage, her duty. It was something she couldn't easily escape. But then, looking at John, at the person who had opened her eyes to a world she had never considered, she felt torn between two worlds. "You know," John said, his voice breaking through her thoughts, "you're more than just your title, Ilara. You're more than your father's kingdom. I can see it in your eyes. You care about what's right." Ilara met his gaze, and something inside her shifted. She wanted to believe him. But the road she would have to walk to make that belief a reality would be treacherous. Every step she took from here could change the course of her life forever. "I don't know what's right anymore," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I've been taught one way my entire life, and now everything feels wrong." John studied her with quiet intensity. "Maybe that's because you're seeing things for the first time as they really are. Sometimes, doing what's right means breaking the rules." Ilara's mind raced. Breaking the rules. She had never considered that before. All her life, she had followed the rules. Her father's rules, the kingdom's rules. It had kept her safe, secure in her position. But as she looked at the man before her, something deep inside her knew he was right. Maybe the rules were meant to be broken. The rustling of leaves snapped her back to reality. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. "We have to move," she said urgently. "The kingdom's soldiers could be near. They must be searching for you." John's eyes widened. "I can't move like this. I'm still too weak." We don't have a choice, Ilara said, her voice tinged with urgency. We'll go deeper into the forest. Stay low. I'll help you. John hesitated, but then nodded. All right. As they began moving through the forest once again, Ilara's mind kept racing. What would happen if they were caught? What if the king sent his soldiers to search for her? Would he see her as a traitor? Her chest tightened at the thought of losing everything she had ever known. But a part of her, the part that had spent the night with John, the part that had learned to question everything, knew it would be worth it. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She could never go back to the way things were. Not after everything she had seen, everything she had felt. Ilara's journey was just beginning, and the consequences of her choices were more than she could ever have imagined. The forest felt more like a maze than a sanctuary now. Ilara moved swiftly, her eyes scanning the trees around her, ever watchful for any sign of the king's soldiers. The adrenaline coursed through her veins, but it did little to quell the heavy weight of fear that pressed down on her chest. She had always been able to escape her duties, her responsibilities, by retreating into the safety of the royal palace. But now, for the first time in her life, she was running from everything she had ever known, from her own bloodline, all for a human. John limped beside her, his injured arm wrapped in cloth that she had torn from her own cloak. He was weaker now, slower. Each step he took seemed to cost him more energy, and it didn't escape Ilara's notice. She had tried to keep their pace steady, but the weight of his wounds was more than he could handle. Her heart ached every time he stumbled, every time he winced. "We should rest," John said between breaths, his voice ragged. "I can't keep up like this." Ilara hesitated, casting a glance behind her. She had heard no sounds of pursuit yet, but she knew the soldiers would not be far. The forest wasn't enough to hide them forever. Still, she knew they needed to take a break, or John might not be able to keep going. "There's a clearing just ahead," she said, her voice low. "We'll rest there, but we have to move fast." John gave a tired nod, his eyes filled with silent gratitude. As they reached the clearing, Ilara set down her pack and began to gather some twigs to start a small fire. She had learned a little from her travels outside the palace, survival lessons she had been taught in secret. It seemed strange now to think of how she had once dreaded these moments, but today she was grateful for them. If not for her knowledge of the wild, she wouldn't be able to care for John. She glanced over her shoulder, her thoughts returning to the path they had left behind. The kingdom, her father, everything she had once known seemed so far away now. And for the first time, that felt like a relief. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything she had seen. "Thank you," John said quietly, drawing her out of her thoughts, "for not leaving me." Ilara paused in her actions, looking at him. His words were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she needed to believe that she was doing the right thing. But the reality of their situation loomed over her. She couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would be found. "It's not about leaving you," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. "It's about what's right." John looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of admiration and confusion. "And what's that?" "What's right, Ilara?" She swallowed hard. She didn't have the answer yet. Her mind was still grappling with the truth of what was happening. She was not only questioning everything she had been taught, but also everything she had come to believe about her own heart. Did she do this out of kindness, out of compassion, or was there something deeper between them that she was too afraid to confront? Before she could answer, a distant sound caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound of hooves. Ilara's eyes widened, panic setting in. "John, get down," she hissed, pulling him behind a large rock in the clearing. He obeyed quickly, his face pale. "What is it? What's happening?" "It's them," Ilara whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "The soldiers. They're looking for you." John's eyes widened in horror. I knew this would happen. I didn't think it would be so soon. Ilara's mind raced. She had to think of something, some way to get them out of this. The soldiers were getting closer. She could hear their voices now, shouting commands to each other. They were searching the area methodically. Time was running out. John looked at her, his expression serious. We can't stay here. They'll find us. Ilara nodded, her pulse quickening. There was no time to waste. She had to make a decision, and it had to be now. She grabbed his hand. Follow me. We'll go off the beaten path. It's our only chance. John hesitated for only a moment before nodding, his determination matching hers. They both scrambled to their feet, moving quietly through the dense trees. The sound of the soldiers grew louder, and Ilara's breath hitched with every step. Every part of her wanted to stay hidden, to keep John safe, but she knew they couldn't afford to remain still. They had to keep moving. As they made their way through the underbrush, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence was almost too heavy. Her heart raced, and her instincts screamed that they weren't alone. She glanced at John, his face set with grim determination, his eyes scanning the trees. Then, without warning, a voice rang out from behind them. There. I see them. Ilara froze, her breath caught in her throat. The soldiers had spotted them. Before she could react, John grabbed her arm. Go. Without another word, they both sprinted deeper into the forest, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them. Ilara's mind raced with fear, but there was no turning back now. This was their fight, their escape. As the forest blurred around them, Ilara could feel the weight of her decision, the choices she had made. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But as the soldiers closed in, her heart beat with an unexpected surge of hope. There was no longer any question about what was right. She had chosen to protect him, to protect the one person who had shown her that there was more to life than duty, more to the world than the palace walls. And now, as they fled together, she knew they were running not just for their lives, but for something deeper, something they could only discover in the heart of the unknown. The sound of galloping hooves faded in the distance, but the urgency in Ilara's chest only grew stronger. She knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they were far enough away, hidden deep in the heart of the forest where no soldier would dare follow. Her eyes darted around the trees, the shadows growing longer as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot seemed amplified now, more dangerous, more threatening. John, still limping but determined, kept pace beside her, his breaths coming harder now. His face was pale, the pain from his injured arm evident, but his eyes were filled with resolve. Ilara had never seen him like this, his vulnerability replaced by a quiet strength she hadn't expected. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. But that hope was short-lived as she glanced over her shoulder. The sound of pursuit had stopped, but the stillness was worse than the chase. Her instincts screamed at her to keep moving, to run deeper into the forest. But the forest was vast, and they couldn't outrun their problems forever. They needed to find shelter, to regroup. She scanned the area ahead. There, just beyond the trees, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves like liquid gold, she spotted an ancient stone structure. It looked like it had been there for centuries, a relic of an older time. Its weathered stone walls rose tall and silent, the entrance overgrown with ivy and moss. A place to hide. John, she whispered urgently, pointing toward the structure. We'll rest there. He looked at her with furrowed brows, confusion in his eyes, but he didn't question her. They moved toward the hidden structure as quietly as they could, every step calculated to avoid making any noise. The air felt thick around them, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When they reached the stone doorway, Ilara held up her hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. She moved ahead cautiously, pushing through the thick vines and moss that covered the entrance. The door creaked as she slowly pushed it open, revealing the dim, dusty interior. Ilara stepped inside first, glancing around to make sure there were no hidden threats. The place felt abandoned, untouched by time. Yet there was something unnerving about it. She couldn't place it. The walls were lined with strange markings, worn away by centuries of weather. But they were still recognizable to her, a mix of ancient symbols from her people. This was an old place, a sanctuary, maybe even a sacred site for some long-forgotten ceremony. This place. John's voice broke the silence. It's incredible. Ilara nodded, her hand grazing the worn stone as she stepped further inside. It's ancient. This was built long before my time. John glanced at her, his brow furrowed in thought. You've never been here before, have you? Ilara shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. No, my father never spoke of it. I don't know why I didn't recognize it until now. John stepped closer to her, his expression softening. Maybe it's because you're not looking for the familiar anymore, Ilara. She looked at him, surprised by his insight. She had been so focused on keeping her world intact, on maintaining her role as the princess, the future queen, that she hadn't allowed herself to see beyond her duties. But now, looking at him, something inside her was starting to shift. Her world, her very perception of what was right and wrong, was changing with every passing moment. It's strange, Ilara murmured, her voice distant. I used to think I knew who I was, what I was supposed to be. But now, everything's upside down. I'm not sure of anything anymore. John studied her for a moment before nodding. I get that. I never thought I'd end up here, with you, of all people. But here we are. Ilara looked at him, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She had spent years focusing on the crown, the kingdom, her father's expectations. But in this moment, with John by her side, all of it felt distant, like she was no longer just a princess, a royal bloodline. She was just Ilara, a woman, uncertain of the world around her but trusting in the one person who had become her anchor. The moment was brief, but it lingered in the air, a silent understanding passing between them. But the stillness wouldn't last. A noise, faint at first, then louder, reached their ears. Footsteps. There were no mistaking the rhythmic sound of heavy boots marching in unison. Soldiers. They had tracked them down faster than Ilara had anticipated. We need to move, she whispered urgently, her voice cold with panic. Now. John didn't hesitate. The pain in his arm, the exhaustion in his body, none of it mattered. He was moving with purpose, following Ilara as she led them to the back of the structure. The stones there were cracked, but there was a small passageway, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. It was their only way out. As they crawled through the narrow opening, Ilara's mind raced. The soldiers were closing in. They had to be. Every moment they spent in the open, every second they hesitated, brought them closer to being caught. Once on the other side, they found themselves in a dense thicket of trees. The sun was nearly gone, leaving the forest darker and more foreboding than ever. But they couldn't stop. Where now? John asked, his voice tight with fear. Ilara paused, her heart pounding. She could feel it now, the weight of the decision she had made. She had crossed a line, chosen a path that was far more dangerous than she had ever realized. But with every step she took, she couldn't help but wonder if this was where she was meant to be. There's a hidden cave, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. A place we can rest, somewhere they'll never think to look. John nodded. Lead the way. As they made their way through the forest once again, the feeling of the ground beneath them, the sound of their hurried footsteps, and the rising tension in the air reminded Ilara of one simple truth. This journey was no longer about escaping her father, her kingdom. It was about survival, and the bond she was forming with the one person who had changed everything. They had crossed the point of no return. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together. The cold night air wrapped around Ilara and John as they trekked deeper into the dense forest. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Ilara's chest, her breaths coming in short, shallow bursts. The soldiers were surely close now, the sound of their pursuit echoing in her mind. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made her heart race. The fear of being caught at any moment was unbearable. They pushed forward in silence, making their way through the thick underbrush. Ilara's eyes were focused on the path ahead, her hand gripping John's firmly. His limp had worsened since the injury, but he kept pushing forward with a quiet strength that surprised her. "Not far now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was meant for him or herself. "We're almost to the cave." John nodded, though he said nothing. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. The weight of his injuries was taking a toll on him, and Ilara could see that his energy was almost spent. But there was a determination in his eyes, a resolve she had seen in him before, when he had chosen to fight for survival, even when all seemed lost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the cave. Ilara had been here before, during her travels outside the palace walls, but it had always seemed like just another hiding spot. Now, with the night closing in around them, it felt like their last hope. She led John inside, her mind scanning the surroundings. The cave was small, hidden behind a cluster of thick trees and bushes, but it was deep enough to offer shelter. The air inside was cool and damp, and the stone walls seemed to absorb the sound of their footsteps as they moved deeper into the cavern. John collapsed against the wall, his eyes half closed from exhaustion. Ilara knelt beside him, pulling out the few supplies she had left. She had no way of knowing how long they would have to stay here, or how much longer John could last with his injuries. But for now, she had to focus on the present. "Stay here," she ordered gently, as she moved to gather some dried herbs and moss from the cave's edges. She knew just enough about healing to make a rudimentary bandage, and try to slow down the infection in his arm. She worked quickly, knowing their time was running out. John, despite his weakness, watched her carefully, his gaze filled with admiration. "You're incredible," he said quietly. Ilara met his gaze, her hand still working with the herbs. "It's not about being incredible. It's about surviving." John chuckled weakly. "I'm glad I'm not alone in this." Ilara's hands paused for a moment as his words settled into her chest. For a moment, she let herself feel the warmth of his presence, the connection they had formed. She didn't have the answers yet, didn't know what this was between them, but it felt like something important, something she couldn't ignore. Once she finished wrapping his arm, she sat back, wiping her hands on her cloak. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but she didn't dare rest. They had to stay alert. The silence of the cave was deafening. The faint sounds of the forest outside, night creatures moving in the underbrush, the wind rustling the leaves, did little to soothe her. Ilara kept her senses sharp, ears straining for any sound of the soldiers, any signs that they were being hunted. But there was something else in the quiet weight of her thoughts. She knew that once the soldiers found their trail, it would be nearly impossible to hide again. Her heart clenched at the thought. She couldn't let them capture John, couldn't let them destroy what little hope they had left. "I can't keep running forever," she murmured, her voice more to herself than to John. "We can't." John's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You don't have to do this alone." Ilara turned to look at him. His eyes were still heavy with pain, but there was a depth in them now, a strength that had begun to take root. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't carrying the burden alone. "I never asked you to," she replied softly. "But I'm glad you're here." John smiled faintly. "I'll stay by your side, no matter what." Ilara's chest tightened. She didn't know what it meant, what would happen when they had to face the king's soldiers or the royal guards. But in this moment, with John beside her, she felt something stronger than fear, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the cave's ceiling. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Ilara kept watch, her eyes darting between the entrance of the cave and the shadows in the corner. She wasn't sure if the soldiers were still searching for them, or if they had given up, but she couldn't afford to relax. Then, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees outside, a sound broke the stillness. Footsteps. Ilara's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively reached for the dagger at her side. She didn't know who it was, but she knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let their guard down now. John looked up, his face pale but resolute. "Do you think it's them?" Ilara shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but we're about to find out." The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped into the clearing at the mouth of the cave. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a soldier. Standing in the entrance, bathed in the soft morning light, was someone she never thought she would see again. Her father. The figure at the entrance of the cave stood tall and imposing, the sunlight from behind casting a long shadow across the forest floor. Ilara's heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. Her father, King Roan, had appeared out of nowhere, like a storm that had gathered silently on the horizon, ready to strike. She stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe her eyes. She had thought, in all her desperation to escape, that she had left him and the kingdom behind. But here he was, in front of her, with the weight of the entire kingdom still resting on his shoulders. "Father." Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something darker, fear. King Roan's eyes were cold as they locked with hers, but there was something else there, too, a flicker of uncertainty, of something long buried beneath years of royal duty. He glanced briefly at John, his gaze hardening, before stepping fully into the cave, his boots echoing in the small space. "You've run far, Ilara," he said, his voice deep and authoritative, though there was a strained edge to it that Ilara had never heard before. "But you can't run forever." John, still sitting against the wall, stiffened at the sight of the king. He'd heard of him, of course, the legendary monarch, fierce and unyielding. But this was a different man. This was a father, a king who had come to reclaim his daughter. "I didn't come to fight, not yet," King Roan continued, his eyes never leaving Ilara. "I came to make you an offer." Ilara's stomach twisted. She had been running from her father, from the chains of her royal life. And now he stood here, offering her something she didn't want to hear. She had already made her choice, hadn't she? "You offer nothing I want," she said sharply, trying to sound strong. But there was a quiver in her voice that betrayed her. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. "I've seen enough of your offers, Father. I've spent my entire life being your pawn." Her father's face remained expressionless, but his eyes flickered with something darker. "You think you've been a pawn, Ilara. You think your position as princess has been a cage. You've been blind." Ilara shook her head. "You'll never understand." John watched the exchange with growing concern, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what was happening. This was more than just the king coming to take back his daughter. It was something deeper, something personal. But he knew enough to stay quiet, to let Ilara and her father hash this out. King Roan's gaze softened for just a moment, and Ilara felt a pang in her chest. Was it possible? Was there still a part of him that cared for her? She wanted to believe it, but years of pain and neglect told her otherwise. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly, stepping closer, his voice now less commanding. "More weary. I've watched you struggle, Ilara. I've watched you fight against a destiny you didn't choose. But it doesn't have to be this way." Ilara clenched her fists. "I don't need your pity. I need freedom." King Roan sighed deeply, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not offering pity. I'm offering you a chance to make things right." "A chance to make what right?" Ilara asked, her voice rising with frustration. "To return to the palace. To sit on a throne, a puppet in your games, a symbol for your kingdom." She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with emotion. "No, Father. I'm done with all of it." King Roan's eyes flickered with something, a hint of regret, Maybe, or the realization that he had lost his daughter long before this moment. Then you've chosen your path, just as I've chosen mine. Ilara took a breath, her chest rising and falling quickly. I have. And it's not with you. The king's face hardened again, the mask of the monarch falling into place. Then you leave me no choice. Ilara took a step back, her heart pounding. What did he mean by that? Was he threatening her? Was this the end of the road, where she was forced to choose between her family and the life she had started with John? You'll never stop me, Ilara said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her. I will never return to your kingdom, never bow to your throne again. John looked from Ilara to the king, his mind still racing. He could see the pain in her eyes, the years of struggle and sorrow that had shaped her. But now wasn't the time to let emotions cloud their path. He needed to act. Before he could say anything, King Roan spoke again, his voice cold and final. Then you've made your decision. I'll give you one final offer, Ilara. Return with me willingly, and you'll never have to worry about your place again. I'll protect you. Ilara's heart twisted at his words. Was this what she wanted? Protection from the man who had never shown her love. She didn't need his protection. She had John, and together, they could survive. No, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I don't need your protection. I need to live my life, my own life. King Roan studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned and walked toward the cave entrance. I see, he said, his tone colder now. You have chosen your path, and I have chosen mine. He paused before stepping out of the cave, his voice carrying back toward them. But know this, Ilara, you cannot escape your blood. You cannot outrun your destiny. With those final words, he disappeared into the forest, leaving Ilara and John alone in the cave. The air seemed to hold its breath as the weight of the king's departure settled over them. Ilara stood still, her mind reeling. What had just happened? The king had left, but had he truly given up, or was he playing a deeper game? Was this just the beginning of a much larger conflict? John stood up slowly, his face serious. Ilara. She didn't answer right away, her thoughts spinning. Her father had left, but what would his next move be? Would he pursue her, send armies after them? I don't know what's coming next, she said finally, her voice quiet. But I know one thing, I'm not going back. John nodded, his expression filled with determination. And you won't have to. Not while I'm here. For a long moment, they stood there, the weight of everything they had just gone through hanging heavily in the air. The king had made his choice, and so had they. But the future was still uncertain, and the road ahead was filled with challenges, danger, and more difficult choices. But for now, they were together, and that was enough.